The Moss Report is brought to you by MycoLife, makers of the world's best mushroom extracts, available exclusively at mycolife.us. Hello, healers. My name is Ben, and this is the Moss Report. I'm here today with my father, author and founder of the Moss Report, Dr. Ralph W. Moss. Hi there, Dad.
Good morning, Ben.
So today, I'm hoping to kick off with a very important and relevant subject that has to do with the paradigm shift of what we understand is the nature of cancer or the cause of cancer. Historically, there has been an understanding that cancer is known as a genetic disease, that it stems from a genetic disorder of some kind, and that now there is a shift in that understanding that either includes or is leaning more towards another theory that has to do with cancer being a metabolic disorder. So can you start maybe by giving us a little backstory or understanding of what the current or the previous theory was, and then we can talk about what the new theory is?
Sure. Well, it was about 1909, Theodor Boveri, who was a German scientist, noticed that in cancer cells there were abnormal chromosomes. The chromosomes are microscopic bodies that we now know serve as the home for the genes. He didn't exactly know that. He didn't really know what the meaning of it was, but he just noticed an association between abnormal numbers of chromosomes and cancer cells. And this is not untrue, but nobody paid much attention to it. He didn't really have much experimental evidence for it. So fast forward into the 1950s, when James Watson and his co-workers discovered the nature of the DNA molecule being the carrier of genetics, the carrier of our entire inherited being.
This is the double helix, right?
Correct. And they named that the double helix because it's sort of like two circular staircases that are intertwined, or two snakes, you could say, intertwined with one another. It's an old symbol, very old religious symbol. And at that point, people started to believe that this great discovery of the nature of the DNA molecule was going to unravel diseases of all kinds, things that had eluded us for many years. And it's true for some relatively rare kinds, different diseases. We know this is very, very important. Genetic treatments are still being developed, and there are genetic diseases. But the idea of cancer being a genetic disease, there's been a lot of time, a lot of water under the bridge, as it were, since then. And it really hasn't held up as a global theory of cancer.
But this is still the prevalent theory out there. So I guess at some point it was adopted as the cause. Is that right?
Right. So at a certain point, this became sort of solidified into a kind of global theory, which has the technical name of the Somatic Mutation Theory. I can break that down a little bit. So we have different kinds of mutations that can occur, which are variations in the structure of our genes. And there are inherited mutations. That's what most people think of as mutations. In other words, you inherited a gene for blue eyes from your parents, me in particular. But then there are mutations that your cells get during the course of your life. For instance, if you are exposed to radiation, the radiation might mutate or change the DNA in some of your cells. And these mutations are generally not desirable. They're usually harmful, or at least they come to our attention more when they're harmful.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a somatic mutation, somatic meaning body, as opposed to genetic material. And that became the theory of cancer, basically.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, one would assume that it wasn't just some one person saying, hey, I have this theory, and then the entire medical community lining up behind them and agreeing that this is the theory that everybody was agreeing with. There had to be some good science to bear this out, or at least some other discoveries that bore out that theory before that was adopted. So what happened there? If there was science that bore that theory out, is that science now being called into question? And what does that landscape look like?
Right. So there was some science for it, and it's undeniable that cancer cells often have detectable mutations in them, but correlation and causation are not the same thing. In other words, you can have genetic changes in a cell, but it doesn't mean that those genetics mutations caused the cancer. The cancer could cause the genetic mutations.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it's not a simple thing to figure out when you're looking at a phenomenon as complex as cancer, which is the cause and which is the effect. And there were some indications, some kinds of cancer that attacking the mutation definitely seemed to have a beneficial effect in terms of the survival of patients.
And how is that accomplished? I mean, through drugs or?
Through drugs.
Yeah.
Yes. So,
okay.
So you have a drug like Gleevec, which
Mm-hmm.
is made it onto the cover of Time magazine when that meant something. But,
Mm-hmm.
it was international news when Gleevec was discovered. And if I can remember back 20 years, the cover of the magazine said something like, this drug blocks or kills cancer. Is this the future? Something like that. So that the anticipation was that by identifying the mutation, in that case it was a simple mutation. It was called the Philadelphia chromosome. It was discovered at Fox Chase Cancer Center in Philadelphia, hence the Philadelphia chromosome. I don't need to describe exactly what that is, but it was a clearly defined change in the DNA, where it was located on which chromosomes. And a very brilliant scientist figured out how to use an antibody, that's to say like a little molecular guided missile, to attack cells that showed that Philadelphia chromosome. It's brilliant work, and it's had a big effect on cancers whose cells have that Philadelphia chromosome. So this seemed to indicate, well, let's just repeat that success with other kinds of cancer as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So other drugs were developed to also have some effect on these somatic mutated
Right.
genes. Is that right?
That's right. Some of them are somewhat effective. Many of them are not effective. And then all kinds of problems started to arise within the theory. I mean, it's an interesting thing, Ben. I mean, if you go back in history and look at theories and practice, I'm not going to give a whole lecture on, my understanding of the history of science, but theories are very important. They're sort of the guiding light of all subsequent practice, right? We have Newton, the theory of, the motion of the heavenly bodies, and we have we have Einstein, the E equals mc squared. These are grandiose, overarching concepts for what the playing field looks like. And then you get down into the nitty gritty of, how you play the game and what the scores are in the different games. But there are these extremely important things, which are the theories. Evolution, Darwin's theory of, they still call it the theory of evolution.
Right.
So in cancer...
And the Big Bang, if you don't mind my
Right.
interjecting.
Right.
Everybody was very firm on the Big Bang and also about the age of the universe as it was understood. And not long ago, NASA launched the James Webb Space Telescope.
Yeah.
And now the age of the universe has been reassessed as being something like 30 or 40% longer than it previously was understood. So even those things that were taken as solid, scientifically understood theories, there's shifting landscapes there.
I remember when the news came out about exactly what you're talking about, they said they found stars that are older than the universe.
Right.
Well, excuse me. I thought those stars are included in the universe. So, yes, exactly.
I think it was a bit of an embarrassment, frankly, within the astrophysics community.
Well, but this is why they launched the Webb telescope to make these more fundamental discoveries. So I think it's all good. It's all working out as it should. The problem is that problems occur within theories. It's hard. You can't always reconcile the facts as they emerge with the overarching theory. Your example is a very good one. Maybe the Big Bang theory is going to fall at some point. Now we have some data points that question the validity of that theory. So the same thing has been happening with the somatic mutation theory of cancer. And the attack on it, if we want to call it that, the criticism of it is coming from several different directions. It isn't just one thing. You mentioned the metabolic. So the metabolic theory, which is also very old, it really goes back to Otto Warburg. It's almost exactly 100 years old. Otto Warburg, who was a Nobel laureate and probably the greatest biochemist of the 20th century, basically said, well, cancer cells eat differently than other cells do. They get their energy differently. And he said exactly what that was. They were more directly reliant on glucose. They have a kind of bacteria-like method of generating energy, which is kind of down and dirty. It requires a lot of glucose to produce the same amount of energy that our normal cells do.
Mm-hmm. So I understand that Otto Warburg came up with this concept and that actually that has now become the basis by which we detect cancer, solid tumors in the body. Is that right?
It's one of the ways. So there is the most common sort of PET scan. PET scan is positron emission tomography, where they inject you with a radioactive substance tied to some sort of marker that would attach itself to cancer. So this is in the so-called FDG PET scan, the most common PET scan by far. They give you a compound, FDG, which is a mixture of a sugar and a radioactive substance. And then the sugar goes to the cancer because the cancer is gobbling up the sugar at several times the rate of normal cells. So there's a difference between the two. Mm-hmm.
It's like radioactive sugar that then can be detected in the scan.
Absolutely is. I mean, it's not table sugar. It's a kind of sugar where there are two sugar molecules bound together, and so they go into the cancer cell. The cancer cell gobbles it up, thinking this is sugar, but it isn't eaten as fast as a single regular table sugar molecule would be because it's in this unnatural shape. So it gives them more time, gives them about an hour, 50 minutes, I think, to be able to detect the presence of the radioactive sugar. But that's
So in a
essentially
scan, it would show up, it would be highlighted as a
correct.
brighter spot or
Correct.
darker spot or something on the
Right.
film.
And then you can measure the brightness of it, and that gives a sort of a measurement of the aggressiveness of the cancer. These are not exact numbers, but they're good enough to give a general idea. And then you can use a CT scan to more accurately look at the area that shows up as taking up too much sugar to give you a more exact picture. So the PET CT, as it's called, mixture or a combination of a PET scan and a CT scan, is really the diagnostic tool of choice for a lot of cancers.
Okay. So then getting back to the subject of the paradigm shift, we now are clear that cancer is different from normal cells around their avidity for eating glucose.
Right.
But how does that change our understanding of what caused them to begin with?
Well, Warburg thought that this change in the energy metabolism was actually the cause of cancer. Not everybody believes that, but it's certainly the existence, the rebirth of Warburg's theories. Warburg died, and I think it was 1970, and the PET scan didn't come about till 20 years later. When I came into the field in 1974, and I've checked this in the PubMed database, there were, I think, 0 articles that year on the topic of Warburg's theory. It had absolutely died. I mean, the only people who continued to talk about it and believe in it were some really alternative medicine type of people. There were some outliers or non-conventional thinkers who kept this thing alive. I happen to know some of them for reasons we don't have to go into, but I actually was at one time pretty close with Dean Burke, and Dean Burke was one of the co-founders of the American National Cancer Institute, and he had been he was the head of a department at NCI, and he had been Warburg's #1 American student. He had literally, as a younger man, had gone over to Berlin and had worked for years in Warburg's lab, and he translated Warburg's articles and books, and so he was a Warburgian, and I got to know him. We traveled together, I had many long conversations. We even went to England together once, so I got to know him pretty well. So I had some exposure that very few other people would have, had the opportunity.
It's a pretty close connection there.
It was. He was like an older mentor to me in some ways. So he was he had gone over to the alternative side, as it were. We don't have to go into all of that. But I also knew a few other people who were involved with Warburg. Of course, I wrote the biography of Albert St. Georgi, and Albert St. Georgi, I think Albert said to me that Warburg was the #1 biochemist of the 20th century. And I said a statement I made earlier, well, I'm getting it from another Nobel laureate who didn't like Warburg on a personal level, but just recognized the fact that, he had a level of genius that's rarely seen in this world.
Now, earlier when we were discussing the genetic theory, you mentioned Watson,
right,
being one of the discoverers of the double helix,
right?
And I can recall that you also met with him,
right?
And so, did you have an opportunity when in your conversations with him to discuss this concept of Warburgian theory versus the genetic theory?
So this is one of the weirdest things. I mean, weird is not exactly weird. Watson was pretty weird, but it's not weird. Isn't the word I'm looking for? It's one of the most dramatic turnarounds in the history of medicine, I would say, is what has happened with this genetic theory, because Watson was the head of the Human Genome Project, a billion-dollar effort that sequenced the entire whatever it is, 18,000 genes, or maybe more, in the human cell. And he was the champion of the genetic theory. He was the co-discoverer with Crick and, of course, Rosie Franklin and others of the DNA molecule, of the double helix. In fact, in his office, above where he sits in his office at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, there's the world's first drawing of the double helix. It's fantastic to look at. Some friend of his, at his instruction, drew the double helix molecule. That's, of course, described in the famous article that he and Crick wrote in 1953. But it's awesome to see this. And
Is he still with us?
Yeah, he is. He's in his 90s. He's fully retired now. It's a long story, but anyway, when I met him, he was still very, very cogent and very opinionated. We could do a whole podcast about Jim Watson, but he's a fascinating character. But here's the crazy thing: he doesn't believe in the somatic mutation theory. He's given up on it completely. He's actually, and he wrote a wonderful article, op-ed for the New York Times some years ago. I think it was, to beat cancer, you have to know your enemy or something like that. But basically, he has re-endorsed the metabolic theory.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's the connection. That's why, and that's part of the connection, because they, at Cold Spring Harbor, under his direction, he was the chancellor and chancellor emeritus, they were investigating a metabolic agent, which you're very familiar with, which is fermented wheat germ extract. That's where the modern day scientific work in America on fermented wheat germ extract actually took place. And it took place because...
At Cold Spring Harbor?
Correct.
Oh, I was under the impression that was like the last project that St. Georgie was working on and he was up at the town where the ferry leaves from. Woods Hole, right. Mm-hmm. Right. But were they collaborating in any way, St. Georgie and Watson? Okay.
No, Watson wrote the book, The Double Helix, in the same cabin that I stayed in, adjoining St. Georgie's house in Woods Hole. He had a cabin down by the water.
So they were actively colleagues, but they weren't
correct.
collaborating on something to do with the study of fermented wheat germ.
St. Georgie...
But what's the connection? I'm sorry, I lost track. What were we talking about? Why was fermented wheat germ brought up?
Because they did the work on fermented... It's a metabolic agent. We'll talk about what that means, but it's a metabolic agent. It's not a genetic agent. It's a metabolic way of altering the cell's metabolism. And Watson himself, who was the first... I'll throw one other thing into the hopper here, which is Watson was the first human being to have his entire DNA sequenced. He was the person, when they talk about the deciphering of the human genome, he was the head of the Human Genome Project for the NIH, and he was the person that they chose to have his DNA sequenced. So literally, this guy discovered the DNA molecule, the nature of the DNA molecule, or its double helix structure, ran the program for the U.S. government, had his own DNA be fully sequenced, and he turned against the theory. And he became, people should look up his op-ed in the New York Times. He became...
We'll put a link in the description if we can find it.
An eloquent proponent for the more of the metabolic approach. And the way he phrased it was interesting. He said, after we discovered the nature of DNA, the structure of the genetic material, double helix, there was like a stampede of scientists to try to use this to explain everything. But he said this was the demise of biochemistry. And biochemistry, genetics took over science or cancer science. Molecular biology, so-called, took over. And this meant that the old classical biochemistry, studying the chemistry of the body and what happens when a person gets cancer and what's going on inside the cancer cell, not at the level of the genes, but at the level of the surrounding material of the cell, the cytoplasm of the cell, that went by the wayside. There are trends, there are fads in science and trends in science that, that occur like in any other field. And he was bemoaning the fact that people stopped looking at the cell as a whole and the cytoplasm of the cell, which the most interesting part of which are the mitochondria, the energy-generating little substances or substructures within the cell. So he was bemoaning that fact and saying we've got to get back to the biochemistry of the cancer, and that means the metabolism, because the genetics are all involved in the nucleus of the cell, mostly in the nucleus of the cell. There's also some genetics, kind of genetics in the mitochondria as well. But what most people are talking about when they talk about the genetics or the mutations, the somatic mutations, you're talking about the nucleus of the cell. But that's like looking at the castle and not considering everything that lies around the castle, that supports the castle, that makes it possible for them, people in the castle, to be eating and thriving.
I think, what comes up for me is when I think about those two theories, one, there's a very stark contrast between a theory that has to do with something that is entirely intangible and that you can have nothing to do to affect in any way, right, and another theory that has to do with something that a person could, in theory, affect. And that the theory that got leaned into, or that still is the prevalent theory, is one that you, as the end user, can't do anything about, and you have to go to a specialist and a doctor to give you a special drug that then is the only thing that can possibly help you. And if it's a genetic condition and there's only drugs that can affect that, then it completely removes the person from having anything to do with anything that looks like healing from cancer.
Absolutely.
So I don't want to get down too deep down a rabbit hole of conspiracy or anything like that. I'm pointing that out as being an actual phenomenon as a result of what's happened. And then the other thing that comes up for me is the question as to, if Watson disavowed the genetic theory and he was the man, how then did not the field of oncology pivot around that information and that article that you say he published in the Times and shift gears, basically immediately, as you would expect? I don't need you to answer that question, but that's what pops up in my head. Yeah. And I think I'd rather have you sort of now tell us, what is the current status of the research and that paradigm shift at present?
Why didn't Watson's op-ed in the Times change many people's minds? Well, a theory is the backbone of the science, of the field. And one contradiction to it doesn't change anything. It's the accumulation of contradictory data that eventually overthrows the theory. And in fact, there was a wonderful book written about 50 years ago called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Kuhn that is a classic work of the sort of the sociological dimensions of science. And it shows how after a while, so many contradictions exist. This is what happened with the theory of the of the sun rotating around the Earth, as opposed to the the heliocentric theory. It wasn't like one person, like Galileo or Galileo came at the end of the process, but people had been criticizing that old theory for 100 years. But then Galileo looked at through his telescope, and that was like, bam, the whole thing the old one basically gave way and the new theory came into existence. And there are many other examples of that.
He also spent the latter part of his life in jail.
19 years under house arrest, right. And what about Bruno, who was burned at the stake for giving the same idea? So change and revolutionary change doesn't just happen overnight. It's a complex process where probably there's just a constant accumulation of contradictory data, and finally something happens that sparks a revolution in science. And we've seen this over and over again. Warburg's comment when he was given the Nobel Prize was, what took them so long? Mm-hmm. Because he made the discovery in 24 and he didn't get the Nobel Prize till 31. Mm-hmm. And you could say the same thing about Einstein. The Einstein theory was 1905. His Nobel Prize was 1925. And there's even a famous case, Peyton Roos, who discovered a viral cause of cancer, who didn't get the Nobel Prize. I think it was 60 years after the discovery that he finally was awarded the Nobel Prize. He was like in his 90s by that time. So just because you come up with the truth doesn't mean, of course, that people are going to automatically accept that. Plus,
and if I can interject, we talk about the way that same type of thing happened with the discovery of immunotherapy, which we know was really 100+ years ago. Right. Then it went back and forth, and it was illegal, and then eventually banned. There was a Nobel Prize given for the discovery, but that was in 2018, 100 and odd years later from its discovery. So yes, we see that research science can precede the actual embracing of it in medicine by 100 years or more. Mm-hmm. And we talk about that topic in depth in our film Immunotherapy, The Battle Within, available to watch for free on YouTube. Right. We'll put a link in the description to that. But not to distract you from the point that you were making about where the current status of metabolic theory is. So do you feel that there's a shift actually taking place, or is there resistance, or what is it all happening right now?
Well, we can judge the status of the theory by a series of articles that are famous within the world of biomedicine, that every student of medicine today is thoroughly versed in, and this is what they're quizzed on, and they use the textbooks that refer to this, and that's called Hanahan and Weinberg. So Hanahan's a retired professor in Lausanne, Switzerland, and Weinberg is a famous professor at MIT, and they started in about 2001 or 2002. They wrote an article called The Hallmarks of Cancer. So the original hallmarks of cancer, there were 6 of them, and they were a description of what was common to virtually all cancer cells. And if I remember correctly, all 6 pertain to the genetics of cancer. They pointed back at the genetics. They were all about the speed with which the mutations take root and take place. Okay. Now, they did another follow-up article in 2011, and then Weinberg wrote a textbook around this whole concept. And then in 2022, Hanahan alone, for reasons I don't know, published an update of the basic hallmarks of cancer. So what's funny, but not ha-ha funny, is that in the new version, the 2022 version of the hallmarks, he's incorporated things from the other fields that have been challenging the somatic mutation theory. So metabolism is now part of the hallmarks of cancer. Immunotherapy is now part of the hallmarks of cancer. The idea of the whole tissue being the source of the cancer, rather that's the so-called society of cells, which is coming out of a different university in the Boston area. That's now part of the hallmarks of cancer. The one thing that's odd is he doesn't talk about cancer stem cells. Cancer stem cells will do the theory in. Cancer stem cells have the potential to do in the somatic mutation theory, but he brings in three other...
What about the metabolic theory, though? Would it also negate some of the aspects of that as well?
Yes, but that's a very slow process. But in my view, the cancer stem cell theory is a more revolutionary, more dramatic contrast. I don't know. I think with some really dramatic results, any one of these methods could do in the theory. But the fact is, and I wrote to Hanahan about this and never got an answer. But my question was, how come in 2011 you spoke so positively about, or 2018, in a separate article, so positively about cancer stem cells and their discovery and their importance, and you left it out completely. There's one glancing reference to cancer stem cells in the article. So I think that this whole theory is tottering. That's my feeling. Is even though you could get a petition of 40,000 scientists to say Ralph Moss is wrong and this is the somatic mutation theory will last forever and ever and ever. I see a pattern here, and it's similar to the fall of other great entities and great theories and things that have stood the test of time for, bleeding people because they're sick, whatever. And then something comes along. I mean, there's a kind of an under, kind of eroding of the foundation of the structure. And then one day something happens and the whole thing falls, and very quickly. And so that's my feeling about it.
It certainly feels as though the metabolic theory among innovative or integrative oncologists is widely accepted. Does this is a follow-up question to what you were talking about, the hallmarks of cancer. I mean, does that publication basically dictate attitudes or policy, or, I mean, is it that influential that is what is understood as being the truth about the origins of cancer?
Well, it's sort of the Bible of present day, modern day oncology. I mean, it's not a biblical in size or scope or anything like that, although his textbook, Weinberg's textbook, is used in all the medical schools. And it's all predicated, and it's a very tremendous amount of scholarship went into doing it, but it's all predicated on the spoken or unspoken theory that what happens in the genes of the nucleus are determining what's going to happen with the rest, the cell. And I think I've seen the theory persist even when I thought there were things happen that I thought would kill it completely. But things, obviously, revolutions don't happen just based upon willpower. It's also, many, many things that are interwoven. But if Hanahan and Weinberg clearly came out and said that we've revised our thinking and this is no longer the fact, well, that would be a very influential thing. But what they've done is more or less the byproduct of the theory. And I think, Ben, you put your finger on it. I didn't mean to move on to another topic because I was 100%, 1,000% in agreement with what you said. The difference here isn't just a debate over a theory. The difference is it's a debate over who's in charge, fundamentally, in terms of dealing with how you approach cancer. Now, I'm not to take anything away from oncologists who are completely necessary and are obviously they are the masters of their own domain, and this is as it should be. They're professional people, professionally devoted to treating cancer. But what's the role of the individual in terms of that situation? And I've been through this now twice in my life, myself, my own prostate cancer, and having lost somebody very close, as you know, to ovarian cancer, and now dealing in the family with somebody with multiple myeloma. I can't recall the head of the team, the oncologist, in any of those three cases making any recommendations vis-a-vis lifestyle modifications, food, supplements, exercise, mind-body medicine. I know there are such things because I get the newsletter from Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and they're always touting their yoga and all these other things. But essentially, the focus of attention, society-wise, the focus of attention is on the nucleus and the genes that supposedly mutated one single cell, one wayward cell, which I believe is the title of one of Weinberg's books. One cell, one individual's bad cell. Mm-hmm. Sort of like the single assassin theory,
Right.
you know.
Something you can't do anything
and
about.
And what are you going to do about that? How can
can't.
you influence? I wouldn't even know where to begin. How do you influence what goes on in the interior nucleus of your cell? By contrast, if you say that the cancer originates in the energy portion of the cell, well, where does that energy come from? It comes from what we eat. That's largely under your control. I mean, to a great degree. It's to a remarkable degree. It also now ties in to other diseases, particularly diabetes. There turns out to be an intimate connection between diabetes and cancer. I mean, nobody disputes that, okay? Mm-hmm. If that's the case, and it is the case, let's now look at diabetes. Diabetes, among all, life-threatening diseases, is the one that's most readily approachable through diet and nutrition and exercise and lifestyle.
We were fortunate enough to be able to speak with one of the leaders of the thought around the metabolic theory, Thomas Seyfried. We did a podcast with him, and he is maybe the most influential voice on that subject. How could you say that Seyfried's work has impacted your understanding of the nature of cancer as a disease?
Seyfried's book, Cancer as a Metabolic Disease, was a life-changing experience for me. I read, it was one of those half a dozen books, I would say, that I've read in my life that was just like, oh my God, it hadn't dawned on me. Like, I knew a lot of the facts in there, but seeing it all laid out in a relatively easy way to understand, but written both for lay people and for scientists, it was just a great thing about 10, 12 years ago. And my immediate reaction, as it has been a number of times in my life, was I got in the car and I made an appointment and I drove to Boston College to interview him. Unfortunately, I didn't video that interview. I think maybe we've done another one with him since then. But Seyfried is really the leader of the revolution in terms of metabolism. And I think he's done something like 150 PubMed journal articles on the topic. So there's nobody else that even comes close in terms of the thoroughness of his work. And I think people would be surprised, as I was. I'm so used to dealing with quote unquote alternative scientists or doctors who have, like a little lab with maybe an assistant, to do this. There were by my count, like 20 people in his laboratory. It's a
Ooh.
it's a real operation there. I mean, and they've done some remarkable work, and some of what they've done blows holes in the somatic mutation theory. I'm not a total 100% proponent of the metabolic theory because I don't see how it correlates with immunotherapy, and I don't see how it correlates with the cancer stem cell theory. I'm trying to work out in my own mind how you combine those three things, plus have an intelligent, rounded critique of the conventional genetic theory into one whole. And I can't say that I have achieved that in my own thinking. There isn't really strong experimental evidence yet for the effectiveness of using anything that we know of metabolically in humans to cure cancer or even get close to it. So
Really?
yeah. I mean, there's good animal research. There's, Seyfried can cure certain cancers in the laboratory using different agents. But I think one of the problems is, and again, this would be a whole nother discussion, that Jane McClellan sort of does address in her work, and that is that cancers are not just reliant on excess glucose for their growth. Would that they were, because if it was simply a matter of chugging along doing this aerobic glycolysis or the Warburg Effect, in other words, over-consuming glucose, we would just cut off their glucose supply.
Right.
And you can cut off their glucose supply by fasting, by going on a ketogenic diet. There's certain drugs that'll do this, so forth. It doesn't seem to work that way. If you cut off the glucose supply of a tumor, it seems as if they then, being wily creatures, these cancer cells and these tumors, switch over to a metabolism of overutilizing fats and proteins.
Interesting.
So that's why you can't cure cancer just by fasting or dieting. It may have happened in some cases, but it's rare. You impact it, but it's not enough in and of itself.
Well, if I'm understanding correctly, for example, IPT, insulin potentiated therapy, the goal is not to use the lowered levels of glucose in the body in order to kill the cancer by starving it out directly, but just to do things that weaken it, which I understand is also done through things like whole body hyperthermia and other integrative practices that we see in wide use all around the world. Your theory seems to be based on the subject of cancer stem cells, and it's still developing, that you're in a growth mindset and trying to parse this all out. But for you, that's where the science ought to be focused. Is that right?
There's tremendous amount of science on cancer stem cells and almost no clinical data. I've gotten so used to this divide between what you wish would happen, what's to me is just screaming out to happen, and what you actually get. The implication of the cancer stem cell is so vast. It changed the paradigm of how we think about cancer just in a more profound way than I think anything else that I've seen in my lifetime.
So I want to congratulate you very sincerely.
Okay.
From the bottom of my heart and on behalf of what I feel should be a world full of gratitude for the production of your latest book, The Moss Method, which is, as we've been saying, is the magnum opus and the culmination of 50 years of dedicated research around less toxic, more natural ways to fight cancer. This is a seminal work, and it's chock full of information that relates to the topics that we're discussing in this podcast about metabolic theory, cancer stem cells, and the nature and the relationship of the immune response to help to fight cancer, and things that can be done to support the body in its fight against cancer and empower people to be able to do actionable things for themselves through nutrition and supplementation and other natural methods to help themselves fight an active diagnosis, to help prevent recurrence of cancer. And it's a remarkable book. And I don't know how. I'm sorry. It's not just my respect and admiration for you and the ethos that you've had in terms of what you've been trying to do your entire career, but my deep desire for everyone in the world to feel empowered to be able to fight cancer themselves. You know, we've seen and we've had personal loss from this atrocious disease, and our goal is to do what we can to help to contribute to the conversation and to people's understanding of their own empowerment to help to fight cancer. So thank you for making that book.
Oh, thank you, Ben. Thanks very much. Well, you had a big hand in it, too. You suggested the book in the first place. You designed the cover, which isn't just a pretty cover. It's an actual graphic representation of the three key things that we focus on in the book. And you put up with me for a year. In New Year's, if you remember, on January 3rd, I put it in my diary, book finished. And in September, it was like a few more changes. No, you know. So yes, I really poured myself into this book. And at 81, it isn't so easy. I mean, my mind is fine, but you know, life gets difficult in a variety of ways. And so, but I wanted this to be as good as I could possibly make it. And it is my current thinking now, and as close as I can come to the truth. I would wish I had the knowledge, and I wish somebody had the knowledge to be able to sew these things together in some nice, simple, easy to understand way. I've done the best I can, being inspired by Albert Einstein. As a young boy of 10, I talk about this in the book. I had a family encounter with Einstein, and this sort of set the tone, and in some ways the course of my life and subsequently, and it impacts the way that I write and what I've tried to do with this book, because Einstein said, simplify but don't oversimplify. In other words, make things as simple as possible. That means I'm not going to lie to people and say, oh, I've got the answer to cancer, and all you got to do is fill in the blank. I've read 50 or 100 or 1,000 books like that in my life. Right. You know, it isn't obviously not that simple. But on the other hand, the world needs to know about what the science of cancer shows. Oncologists need to know this because now they've graduated from medical school. They've gone through their 3 years of training in hematology and oncology, very technical stuff, and they have to know how to deal with incredibly complicated situations that arise both from the disease and from the treatment of the disease. But to follow the science, and as you were the victim of my obsession with cancer, because I don't
feel that way.
But you know what I mean. It's like,
I do.
You know how.
Well, it was the primary subject of conversation at
right. Most dinner table, right? At least we had a dinner table. Right. But so I've done the best that I can as at this point, and I think from one of the things in the book, and we're not going to get into this today, but we will need to talk about is, so you have something like 20,000 journal articles on the topic of cancer stem cells. This is a rather important topic. I mean, people have written books about mangosteen, and there's maybe, 7, I'm just pulling that out of the air.
Yeah.
But there might be 7 articles on mangosteen. Nice, good. I'm glad those 7 articles exist. But cancer stem cells are in an entirely different category. I mean, you have
Right.
top people who really should have gotten the Nobel Prize, and I don't know what the Nobel Committee's thinking is, but it's so obvious that this is a tremendous advance. And we also know how natural foods and food elements kill cancer stem cells.
Right.
That's probably the if you were going to take away one thing from my book of practical
Right.
importance, that would be it. We got the formation of a theory of cancer based around the existence of a small kernel of cells driving the entire process of the formation of tumors and of metastases, a small subcategory, possibly as little as less than 1% of the cancer cells that are truly dangerous, cancer stem cells. We have a pretty beginning of an idea of where they come from and why they're there. And we know about 20 different substances that will kill the cancer stem cells. Nobody is talking about this.
Right.
That's why it's a big focus of the Morse Method book. And if the book really takes off, I think it's going to change the way the complementary world thinks about the natural products, because they're not, just like the cancer cells are not all equal. The products that are out there, there's 1,400 by the last count that I've seen, 1,400 different natural products on the market, the American market. It's probably more even than that, but let's just say that's about the number, 1,400. Now, not all of them are of equal value to the cancer patient. What are you going to do? You only have so much time. You only have so much opportunity. And then there's the question of food versus supplements, which I deal with in the book. But the point is that there are some things out there that are tremendously powerful in the world of food and nutrition and non-toxic substances. And
versus cancer stem cells specifically.
Correct.
Right. So that's the key component, is that we're not just talking about getting good enough nutrition to support the body's health and metabolism, for example.
Right.
We're talking about something that is biochemical, that relates to a molecule that when it interacts with a cancer stem cell, it kills it.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is that your research has led you to believe that the cancer stem cells are at the core of all of the subject about the cause of cancer, the spread of cancer, the recurrence of cancer, all of that. Yeah. And that somehow or the other, the medical community is a little bit late to the game, picking up on where all the research science has been pointing us. And we're talking about in the book, I say we, but you're talking about in the book a direct observational science that has shown to fight cancer stem cells in laboratory science, that's got good scientific methodology behind it, that these are all natural substances that are mostly phytochemicals, plant-based chemicals that you can get into your bloodstream that are non-toxic and fight these cancer stem cells. And why this is not known and talked about in oncology, and why this is not known more broadly even in the integrative community, which we are a part of, is to us, that is our campaign of awareness that the Moss Report is on, and we will continue to talk about as the most relevant topic. It has been my pleasure and my privilege to be your son and to be helping to produce the content that you've produced, and it's really, I can't even put it into words, how much and in how many ways you've influenced my life and my thinking and my desire to be both objective and unbiased and to serve the common good, the humanist values that you've brought me up to believe in. And I only hope that, I'll never be able to do the type of writing and research that you've done, that at least I can help to facilitate the dissemination of those things that you've worked so hard to dig into and that you want to share. And that's my job and my role and my pleasure.
Well, thank you, Ben. Thank you. I think as we keep our eye on the goal, we can't go wrong. That's my feeling.
All right. For now, for the Moss Report, I'm Ben Moss. How are you healing today? The Moss Report is brought to you by MycoLife, makers of the world's best mushroom extracts, available exclusively at mycolife.us.